So I wish I could say that I was really surprised by what Israel did in Gaza, the latest offensive in December 2008. I know that the extent of the attacks was really horrendous, but following the 6-month siege of Gaza, which had killed already hundreds of Palestinians and blocked off the medical supplies, food, gasoline, and electricity, Operation Cast Lead, which is what it was named by the IDF, eventually killed over 1,400 Palestinians and injured 5,000 more. And a third of those casualties and injured were children, if not more. During the operation, Israel demolished Palestinian homes and schools and universities and mosques and food markets. And it carried out these horrendous war crimes that some people have talked about, that we saw in the movie, in the Democracy Now! Footage. But really, the attack on Gaza, I think, was inevitable. And it was inevitable because Israel has continuously been testing the international community to see how far it could go. And continuously, the international community has been not only saying it's okay, but saying, please go ahead, harder. And that's what's happening. We saw this during the 17 days of Operation Days of Penance in September 2004 in Gaza, against Gaza, where 107 Palestinians were killed, including 17 children and 431 injured. We saw it during Operation Summer Rains, which was launched in June 28, 2006, also at the time of the Israeli attack on Lebanon, but Israel had bombed Gaza's only power plant, leaving over half the population of Gaza without any source of electricity necessary for refrigeration and medical supplies. And it was the first time that doctors were talking about this use of dime ammunition. This and the subsequent Operation Autumn Clouds, which was a 6-day-long offensive in November 2006, resulted in the killing of over 400 Palestinians, half of whom were civilians and 1/4 of whom were children. And ostensibly the intent of all of these attacks was to free the abducted Corporal Gilad Shalit, or it was to end the rockets being fired on Sderot, or it was to bomb some terrorist tunnels that were being built. There was always an excuse, there was always a reason, but they were only possible because the international community was standing by and waiting and supporting them. Of course, these are only some of the Israeli attacks that were conducted against the Palestinian people, and this is just since the turn of the century, just in the past 8 years. So this was coupled with continuous siege, the confiscation of land, the erecting of the apartheid wall, the incursions into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, military roadblocks, checkpoints, denial of medical services, the uprooting of trees, demolition of houses, countless other injustices that are happening on a daily basis. And I lived in Palestine for 10 years, and I would say each day I witnessed a different type of injustice and an increased attempt at humiliation and demoralization. And ultimately, the objective of Israel becomes quite clear. The objective of these attacks is not for any of the stated reasons that Israel gives. It's really to attain this, what Rahim Barghouti called the self-fulfilling prophecy of a land without a people. That's ultimately what is needed, because it had people and they don't know what to do with them. And as Kovel said, there is sumud, there is steadfastness, there is people, despite the 1948 catastrophe, despite attempted, continuous attacks against the people, injuries, imprisonment, 10,000 and more Palestinians in prisons, despite the total denial of the existence of the Palestinian people, they are still here. And really, I think Israel's major problem is that it doesn't know what to do next. And this is why that ferociousness that we're seeing in these attacks, that attempt to kind of maintain these types of myths is becoming to the extent that it is today. So the question remains, so what do you do? You criticize Israel, you condemn its actions, you carry out demonstrations, you raise awareness, you do education programs, you try to contact media, you call on your governments to act, and in the end, nothing changes. And this, I think, is the atmosphere in which what brought about really the existence of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. On the first day of that bloody Operation Cast Lead, the Palestinian BDS Committee, the National Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Committee, automatically came out with a strong call urging the international community to take action in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel to ensure that Israel ends its violations of Palestinian rights and international law. And making the connection between this latest atrocity and the ethnic cleansing that was ongoing, that had occurred since 1948, which resulted in Gaza's large refugee population, the BNC held the international community to account for their direct complicity with Israel's ongoing war crimes. In the statement, they said, Israel's war crimes and other grave violations of international law in Gaza, as well as in the rest of occupied Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem, could not have been perpetrated without the direct or indirect complicity of world governments, particularly the United States, the European Union, Egypt, and the other Arab regimes. And that understanding that the Arab world and even the Palestinian official leadership was complicit in the actions that Israel was undertaking enabled this evolution of something called the civil society. That civil society now must act where governments are failing to act. That neither in the US, nor in Europe, nor in the Arab world, nor even in Palestine can we wait for our governments to take action. Numerous civil society organizations automatically reinforced the BNC call. On December 29th, just 2 days later, and after Israel bombed the Islamic University in Gaza, the Palestinian Federation of Unions of University Professors and Employees added their voice to the urgent call, and countless other calls came out from Gaza and came out from other places. And what was amazing for me was just as immediate and just as intense was the response of the international civil society community. In Canada, the Ontario Division of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which represents some 200,000 government and other public sector workers, passed a motion calling for an academic boycott. They had previously passed, QP had previously passed a motion calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in general, but they specifically, in response to the Palestinian Federation's call, called for an academic boycott. British and French academics issued similar statements calling for a boycott of Israel, and in the the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, which modeled itself on the Palestinian campaign, was also launched, calling for the boycott of and divestment from Israeli institutions that failed to oppose their government policies. We saw numerous other institutions, including unions, university student groups, churches, in Ireland, in Australia, in Spain, in South Africa, make similar calls, and even Amnesty International, which had documented Israel's violations over and over again, but never said what to do about it, finally called for an arms embargo because of the use of weapons that violate international law and the disproportionate use of force that Israel exhibited that might propose serious infractions. They called on countries who sold Israel weapons and munitions that were used during Operation Cast Lead. Their selling of those weapons could constitute war crimes in and of itself because they were complicit in these actions. But more significantly, not only did members of the international community intensify their calls or their pledges to make boycott, divestment, and sanctions, they began to take concerted action. And that's, I think, which was one of the most interesting developments post-Gaza. In Britain, student groups at 24 universities organized sit-ins and building occupations to demand that their educational institutions condemn Israel's war crimes and to cancel speaking events or honorary titles for Israeli officials. And these sit-ins actually came out with results. So you had Cardiff in Wales and the University of Plymouth and Strathclyde in Scotland taking decisions to divest from specific companies, not a general, yes, we support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but to divest from specific companies that were doing business with Israel. In the US, of course, we had that historic decision by Hampshire College, although they're backpedaling as quick as they can, but it's done. They did it, it's over, right? They became the first American university to divest from companies on the grounds of their involvement with the Israeli occupation. And the divestment, which was a direct result of a 2-year ongoing campaign by the students, was also significant in that Hampshire was the first college in the country to divest from apartheid South Africa some 32 years ago.